Good to see you, Dave.
Jay,
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a seat.
This is the hot seat.
This is the hot seat.
right.
We are going to talk about SPACs and whether or not they are a pathway to greatness, as they may have well been for Boxed, or a whole lot of hype. And there is certainly controversy, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But welcome, everybody. My name is Dave Soren. I'm chair of the Venture Capital and Emerging Growth Company practice at McCarter & English. And I am delighted that we are one of the lead sponsors again this year, as we have been since the inaugural Propelify.
Awesome.
Yeah, listen to that.
There you go.
I've got to thank Aaron and team, because once again, they just hit it out of the park. This is going to be a great event, and a lot of great speakers today.
Yeah, I agree with that, by the way. So the last time I was here was 2019, and it was like Woodstock out here. For anyone that was here in 2019, it was like rain and mud. I was in a suit, and that's why I was like, I'm not doing that suit thing again. So, but it didn't rain today, and it's great. So it's awesome to see that we're back.
Suits are outlawed, but vaccines are important.
Right.
We're fortunate today to be joined by Che Wang, CEO of Boxed, for a chat about what is now one of the hottest and perhaps more controversial financing mechanisms that, as you heard from Alan, has dominated the headlines for at least the last couple of years. So we're going to talk SPACs, pathway to greatness or hype. A little bit of context first, and I apologize if some of this is repetitive from what Alan told us, but SPACs, or Special Purpose Acquisition Corporations, are hugely popular. A bit less so currently than earlier in 2021, but still a major force. In the last 18 months, 80% of the number of IPOs completed were SPACs, and nearly 70% of the value produced by IPOs were SPAC transactions. There was a 400% increase in SPACs in just 2 years. For some, perhaps you, this represents really a return of the IPO market that has been largely inhospitable to emerging growth tech companies over the last 15 years. So it's been a real challenge. And SPACs have become increasingly associated with exciting new tech and entrepreneurial businesses like Boxed. For others, SPACs are a highly speculative transaction that are a backdoor way to go public for companies that the more traditional way of going public might not be available to them. And so we're now going to hear about this from an expert, from Che. So Che, thank you for agreeing to share your experience.
No problem. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I am living it at the moment, so I can tell you from the inside what it's like.
Well, that's exactly what we want to hear. So can we start with, tell us a little bit about Boxed and why you chose the SPAC mechanism for your financing transaction rather than a traditional IPO.
So Box is an e-commerce company. We sell to businesses and consumers all consumer packaged goods products, mostly in bulk. We started off in Edison, New Jersey, where we grew up. And throughout 2020, we were a major purveyor of toilet paper to all those around the country. So I was, like I said, thank you very much. I was the
much needed essential service.
I was the most popular guy at my high school 20 years too late. So I had all these messages on Facebook, folks I didn't even know I was friends with were like, hey, and the exact kind of quote that summed up 2020 for us was that in our facility, I went there when there was like a massive shortage of toilet paper, as we all know. There was like this cavernous facility that we have, and it's just like an Indiana Jones like warehouse full of toilet paper, like to the ceiling, and there's like 40-foot ceilings, and so and someone said like estimated the street value of the toilet paper in the building, and I was like, I never want to hear street value and toilet paper in the same sentence again, but there we were in 2020. So that's what we did, and that's what we do.
Got it. And so why did you select a SPAC rather than an IPO?
So one of the things I think there's the right reason to go public via SPAC, and there are definitely the wrong reasons. I will say the right reasons. It allows you to raise a lot more capital than you could in a traditional IPO. And then two, it also allows you to tell your story a little bit better. What do I mean by that? When you're on a traditional IPO roadshow, there's a lot of kind of folks in the room like really telling you what you can and cannot say. You cannot project out future numbers to potential investors. you have to be very careful around forward-looking statements. When it comes to the SPAC, because it's a merger and not a traditional IPO, because theoretically the SPAC has already IPO'd, you're not under the same rules. So you, instead of filing an S1, you end up filing an S4, which has certainly different kind of connotations around it. So for us, being able to tell potential investors the story of 2020, how it affected our business, both good and bad, was one of the critical reasons why we went via SPAC. So what do I mean by that? 2020 for a B2C business, you could imagine, we sold toilet paper, disinfectant wipes, Oreo cookies, canned foods. It was not a bad year for being a B2C driven business. But we also are a wholesaler. So we service enterprises, Fortune 500 companies all around the country. So you can imagine B2C went way up, B2B went way down. And so telling potential investors what our financials look like from our point of view when the world normalizes was something we could not do via a regular IPO.
Right.
And so that's part of the reason why we chose the SPAC product.
Gotcha. Tell us what were some of the challenges that you experienced in the process and what you thought some of the benefits were, other than that disclosure issue that you were just talking about.
I would say some of the benefits, especially as we embarked upon the process, it was like, SPACs were the hottest thing ever about 8 months ago. So when we got into it, just the amount of interest and the amount of kind of capital out there was something I had never seen in my career. I think the more difficult part is that if anyone here is contemplating a SPAC, you should definitely call us. I will give you the full story of how it all works. But you're basically doing 3 deals in one. So instead of a traditional IPO, you are selling your company to a SPAC, theoretically, so there's a merger agreement. You are raising a PIPE, which is, long story, you're raising private capital or capital to go along with the SPAC. And then 3, you're also going public because you're filing an S4. So you're stepping up your company to become public ready as well. So it's like 3 in 1, so it's quite a bit of work. So the days of easy SPAC money, I think, are long behind us.
Well, and I think the point that you're making is really important for everybody to understand, and that is there are SPACs like yours where there was a real operating company in existence, and there are SPACs that simply raise capital to do a purchase of an operating business that may not even be designated yet. So these are very different types of transactions when you're talking about your SPAC, a SPAC for a company like Boxed, and a SPAC for a company that is raising money to buy an as yet undesignated business. And it is exactly that has created a lot of the controversy. Much like we saw a few years ago with digital securities and cryptocurrency, there were transactions that were based in real economic rationality, and there were transactions that were done simply to meet the hype, and people thought it was an easier way to raise capital.
That's absolutely true. I thought you were going to ask me about my crypto wallet, so I was like, let's not go there because there's some wild stuff in there.
Yeah, no question about it. We know that there was an incredible high last year, earlier this year for SPACs. Then there was a retrenchment. Do you think that SPACs are over, or do you think this is now a permanent additional mechanism for capital raising?
I will say, and despite the fear of being on freezing cold takes on Twitter, I will say that SPACs will be around for a long time. I just think when you look at the numbers, the amount of venture capital or private capital going into companies these days, by definition, it's going to inflate the values. And also by inflating the values, almost by definition, there's not enough companies out there to gobble up all these other billion-dollar companies. And so all these folks will need some sort of event. And the public markets are probably one of those events that will be more and more popular. And so if you just look at the numbers, over the last 2 years alone, there's been almost 400, if not more, unicorns kind of minted. So if you just look at how many trading days are available for new IPOs, we're starting to bump up against that. There's not enough calendar days at the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ to really swallow all these IPOs if they all happen next year. And so, I think you're going to see it around for quite a long time. But I also think you're going to see a bifurcation of hey, like the folks that really should be public, or the
Exactly
folks
right.
that just won't make it public, even via SPAC.
I could not agree with you more. I think that what you see when the SPAC craze was at its height is that you get everybody trying to run in, and ultimately, as the financing mechanism matures to some degree, it separates out the wheat from the chaff. And there will always be folks who try to use a new financing mechanism or a new security, like we saw in some of the digital securities, as a way to, they think, raise money very easily, freely, with fewer regulatory hurdles. But the really good companies that will benefit from SPACs, I think, will continue to do so. We have seen, unfortunately, since about 2006, a largely inhospitable IPO market for emerging growth technology companies. If you were a unicorn, sure, you could go public, but the companies that have traditionally driven innovation, found themselves largely foreclosed from the public markets. And between Regulation A+, which is another discussion, and the use of SPACs, I think we are seeing a resurgence, frankly, and an ability for companies like yours to access lots of capital in a way that makes more sense than a traditional IPO. Some people talk about the fact that with SPACs, there's a greater valuation benefit than the traditional IPO market. Can you speak to that?
I could certainly see that being the case. So there are now hundreds of SPACs out there with hundreds of billions of dollars of dry powder looking for, it's probably like I don't even know what the number is these days. It's a gigantic number. It's hundreds of billions of dollars looking for companies to merge with. And so you get, let's just do a very simple scenario here. Let's just say this group right here has hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is the finite group of companies that you can get. Guess what? The value is going to go up, and so that's kind of what that's what we see, what we've seen, and I'm sure that's what we will see into the future. With that said, though, I think that valuation that the SPAC pegs on you needs to be vetted not only by the pipe that you raise to see if other public company investors believe in that value and would they buy into it, and then two, it's kind of, I guess, transient in time, meaning that the minute you're public, no one cares after you're public whether you went via SPAC or anything. You're a public company at that point, and so the market will dictate what your true valuation will be.
That's a really good point. And some people talk about the fact that depending upon the public entity into which you merge, there's sometimes the issue of having to run even harder, right? When you've gone public via a SPAC, and be able to retain and improve upon that valuation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So it has its good and its bad. Like when you tell investors kind of what you want to do, you better, especially in the public markets, you better sure as hell do it. And so so with the S4, you're telling investors exactly what you want to do. So the bar is that much higher because you told them unequivocally what you were going to do.
Yeah, this is something we've seen, in the early days, sometimes when companies went public prematurely, we saw that issue. With the old days when we talked about reverse merging into a public shell, warrant overhang issues, et cetera. Did you have any of that with your public entity?
Not as much. So we got caught in the kind of warrant accounting kind of debacle where the SEC kind of gave hints that like people weren't accounting for the warrants correctly, but didn't give full guidance. And so there was basically a pause of almost a month of all SPACs. It just totally froze. So luckily we were on the beginning end of that, so it didn't affect us in the middle of our process as much. One other thing, though, that most folks are not realizing is that with all these SPACs and potential companies de-SPACing, one of the important things is who's going to cover your stock and your company afterwards.
Absolutely.
And there's not enough equities analysts to cover all these companies that are coming public. So yes, you can say, I'm a public company and I made it there, but if no public company equities analysts are covering your stock, and you have a very thinly traded stock with no institutional interest, it's going to be a very miserable existence as a public company. So, so that's another thing that I think is a dynamic that no one's really talking about.
Yeah, I think, Che, you raise an extremely important point, because if you're a publicly held entity and you are orphaned by the investment banking community and the analyst community, Your aftermarket is going to be really choppy, if not downright turbulent.
Yeah, the equities analysts, it's quite, unfortunately, I think it's a shrinking industry. So less and less equities analysts out there. They're just not being as well funded by the banks. And so hopefully there'll be a reversal of that, but at least right now it's much smaller than where it was, 5-10 years ago. And so you look up some of your, like, if you read an analyst report, look at what other stocks those folks are covering. It's probably like everywhere from Wheat Maps to Nike to Ralph Lauren to like Home Depot. And so they're just being forced to cover more and more names. So if you're SPAC number 400 that wants to get coverage, there's a good chance you're not going to get it. And if no one's covering you, it's hard to get attention a lot of times.
And it's also really important to be covered by the right people. Industry focus is critical on the part of equity analysts. So that's a troubling trend that you're citing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say check the veracity of that. If you do pick up your next analyst report, just actually Google what else they cover. Yeah. And I guarantee you it will shock you in terms of their coverage universe.
Tell us a little bit about the process itself. How did it start? How long did it take?
Yeah, for the definitive process, I've even got to check myself these days. So definitive process, you should read the S4 very carefully.
Indeed.
Because I've been instructed to say that these days. So there's a full accounting of how it all came together. But basically, there were different SPACs that were very interested, different potential kind of outlets for us, and we just met one that totally understood our business and had great operators on the other side. So the SPAC that we eventually merged with, or are merging with now, it's called Seven Oaks. It's one of the only ESG SPACs out there, and also one that's run by a gentleman who used to be in the grocery and CPG industry, but he was also co-founded by someone who was for 25 years at General Atlantic, who also knew tech and software. So I thought it was a great potential marriage.
So you raise a really interesting point here, and that is on the part of the operating company, the diligence that you needed to undertake with respect to the SPAC that you ultimately selected.
Yeah, you have to do a lot of diligence, and it's like, I didn't make up the term, but there's banking bake-offs, and now there's like SPAC-offs as well. So like it's pretty wild, but there's just so many SPACs out there that you have to do your due diligence because, again, it's a marriage. Like you're finding a new house, or you're basically like a hermit crab finding a new shell, and it better be a damn good house or a damn good shell because you're going to live with each other for a good amount of time.
How long did the process take for you to pick the SPAC that you would ultimately go with?
It took several months.
Several months.
Several months. And so we were okay allowing the SPACs to do very deep diligence on us. We felt like we were one of the companies that had an operating history, a real potential for a future in the public market. So the due diligence process with all the SPACs took quite a while. And we weren't as comfortable with, you hear some stories of SPACs doing 2 days of courting and they sign. That was not our process.
Well, I'm sure that served you well.
Hopefully.
The worst part of doing programs like this is watching the clock go down. We are at 1.5 minutes. So does anybody in the audience have any questions for Che? Nobody.
This was easy.
Yeah, really. This is the kind of class you like to have, right? Yes.
The toilet. So the street value of the toilet paper that we had in our facility at one point was estimated to be like tens of millions of dollars just in that one building alone.
And you couldn't pitch that to the IPO, but you could pitch that in a SPAC.
Yeah, exactly. And my first reaction when someone told me that was like, lock the doors now.
Yeah.
And we actually had contemplated needing kind of 24-hour armed security around the building because if someone had busted down the doors, it would be like Fast and the Furious. Like they would make out with like, instead of DVD players, tens of millions of dollars worth of toilet paper. So yeah, I never thought I'd be on stage saying that. So this might all be a simulation, but here we are saying that that's what happened last year, man. I can't make that up. It was a wild year.
You wouldn't have wanted to see my garage about a year ago.
Yeah.
My wife made sure we were never going to run out of toilet paper. Yes, sir.
So what do you think are the changes to your business that are permanent?
Interesting.
Because of
I think I was never so the question was, what do I think will change from 2020 permanently versus what was more ephemeral? I think the talk that stores were dead and everything, that's ephemeral. Like, stores are going to be around us for a very long time. I think the permanent change is the amount of e-commerce adopters that traditionally didn't buy some of these categories online. So our business now is almost 70% deep small towners or rural across the country. And so that audience, I believe, have really come online and will stay online because it was out of necessity last year. And last thing is, like, buying stuff online, it's like your first time touching a smartphone, first time like getting an electric car. It's like, I don't know if I want one. I don't know but the first time in it, you're just like, my life has changed and like this is where the future is. And so for all those folks that bought online for the first time last year, I think they're going to stick around.
And I believe that the whole trend toward e-commerce and online shopping clearly was in existence before the pandemic. The pandemic put a spotlight on it, and you have a lot more adopters out of necessity. I don't think that's going away. Guys, thank you all
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.